Mentor-protégé arrangements provide a great way for small businesses to win federal work along with their large business mentors. The popular program goes back decades, but mentor-protégés aren't guaranteed to win. In one recent protest case, the problem was the buying agency was not convinced that the protégé could actually do the work. Federal Drive host Tom Temin got details from Haynes Boone procurement attorney Dan Ramish.
I guess the context or background of this is SBA is looking to kind of put a penny on the governor with mentor-protégés because they win an outsized number of contracts. In this case, though, they lost and the protest was sustained. Tell us more.
Sure, Tom. So in this case, this was a procurement under GSA's STARS 3 GWAC vehicle, and the task order RFP sought a range of technology support services for the Air Force Civil Engineering Center. And it was structured as a primarily fixed-price task order with a one-year base period and 4 one-year options and an optional 6-month extension. The RFP in this case provided for a 2-phase evaluation process, with the agency evaluating the most important non-price evaluation factor in the first phase, which was past performance experience and team structure. And the offerors were instructed to submit past performance and relevant experience examples and to complete a template and narrative describing the team structure.
And that's the phase at which this particular mentor-protégé team didn't make it.
That's right. So Tygrove was a mentor-protégé joint venture between a large business, Insurso, and an 8A program participant, Potomac Haven. Insurso, in this case, was actually the incumbent contractor, which also is not an uncommon scenario for mentor-protégé joint ventures, where a large business incumbent faces a follow-on contract that will be set aside. A fairly common approach to staying in the running for the follow-on, even though it's set aside, is to use these mentor-protégé joint venture vehicles. So that's what happened here. Of course, the catch is that the protege firm has to actually contribute, and you can't rely completely on the mentor incumbent's ability to perform the work.
Right. So in that sense, then, a small business, even in a mentor-protege, is obligated to perform a certain amount of work, just as if they were a regular subcontractor as a small business.
Yes, so there's a performance of work requirement for the protege firm in a mentor-protege joint venture. They have to perform a minimum of 40% of the work that's performed by the joint venture. So that's always a consideration, and there's also a consideration to ensure that the protege is contributing meaningfully to the work that will be performed under the contract. And so here, the government did the first phase assessment. Tygrove had submitted 7 different past performance and experience examples, 2 from the large business partner Insurso, 2 from the protege Potomac Haven, 1 from the joint venture itself, something you don't often have. In many cases, the joint venture will have been formed and won't necessarily have its own experience to draw from or past performance. But in this case, they did have 1 example and then a couple of examples from a subcontractor. And so put all of this together to address this first factor, and the technical evaluation team came back and assigned an adjectival rating of marginal and a risk rating of high risk. And on that basis, Tygrove didn't go on the next phase of the procurement, and when they were notified of that, they submitted this protest.
Right, okay, and this was a GAO protest?
That's right.
We're speaking with Haynes Boone procurement attorney Dan Ramish, and so the protest, just to be clear, was filed by the main contractor, the mentor, but it was the protege evaluation that got them knocked off.
Actually, Tom, the way that these work, it's the joint venture that itself that is offeror.
Okay,
so
good.
The joint venture is a separate entity.
All right, so the joint venture filed, but the issue was performance capability of the protege in this case.
Right. So the technical evaluation team looked at the examples that were submitted in response to this first factor, and they found that Tygrove didn't provide compelling or applicable examples to demonstrate that the joint venture and the protege, and not just Insurso, the incumbent, could perform the work successfully. And the TET evaluated both the joint venture itself and the joint venture members and found that, well, Insurso established that it had the capability to perform. Of course it did as the incumbent. The protege, Potomac Haven, did not demonstrate that it could perform the 40% of the work that was required under SBA regulations. And the TET also questioned Potomac Haven's ability to serve as the managing partner of the joint venture, which is another requirement under SBA regulations. Potomac Haven had a small number of individual task requirements that it was assigned, and that raised some concern for the agency as to whether it would be able to function as the managing partner of the joint venture.
And by the way, as incumbent, Potomac Haven wasn't there. They were going to be there for the follow-on.
That's right. It was actually the large business partner
Insurso
that was the incumbent. Exactly.
Right. So Insurso may be erred in picking the wrong protege for the follow-on under a joint venture.
That's right. And it may be a natural assumption for the incumbent to assume that their joint venture would obviously be qualified and have ample capabilities to perform the follow-on contract because it performed it on its own under the predecessor contract. But both JV members have to be involved and demonstrate that they'll be able to contribute. And the agency here questioned whether that was the case and found that there was risk that there would be a problem with the protege's performance.
And the GAO then, in evaluating the protest, sided with the agency.
Yes. So the agency also, I should mention, assigned an additional risk because it found that the team structure was poorly blended and that it conveyed low value on collaboration and new idea exchange within the task and overall on the contract. And also, more broadly, concluded that the 8A protege participant, Potomac Haven, brought very little to the proposal other than its 8A status, which is always a big problem for a joint venture if the 8A that's supposed to be benefiting isn't really bringing anything other than its status.
All right. Other than the fact that Potomac Haven sounds like an old age home, what were some of the takeaways from this case for the mentor-protégé program, do you think?
So GAO looked here in its decision at the SBA rules, and it concluded that the agency didn't do anything that ran afoul of those rules, and it also got SBA to weigh in on this. Now, the rules and GAO case law don't assign a specific degree of consideration for the mentor member or the protege member, but they require that the criteria can't be exactly the same for the protege as for the mentor. And GAO found in this case that the consideration of the 40% requirement under SBA regulations was appropriate and didn't cut against the SBA rules. And more broadly, again, the issue that the protege couldn't really contribute anything beyond its status on the face of the proposal was a big problem. So the agency had acted reasonably in looking at the ability of the protege to perform the requirements under the SBA regulations. That's helpful guidance for agencies because they often run up against this rule that they can't consider the protege and hold the protege to the same standards as every offeror. But then finding a way to appropriately consider the protege's contributions is sometimes a struggle. And so in this case, this demonstrates one approach that an agency can take to look at what the requirements are under the SBA regulations and how the protege's proposed role stacks up against those.
And more importantly, on the contractor side, pick your protege carefully. Protege really is not maybe the most accurate word for it because protege sounds like beginner or learner. And in this case, the agency didn't want a beginner company. They wanted someone that could do 40% of this work under an incumbency that they were pleased with for several years. And they found that that protege was a little bit too proto.
That's exactly right. The protege has to have some existing past performance and experience as a baseline to be able to provide something of value on the contract. They can't just have their name listed there with their status as part of the proposal.
We'd all be proteges.
Exactly.
That's Dan Ramish, a procurement attorney with Haynes Boone, speaking with Federal Drive host Tom Temin. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.